afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sue Thomas, and President of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel, and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio, or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, May 14th for this week's Friday Forum. Today we will hear from NuScale Power CEO Paul Lorenzini about the future of nuclear energy. But first, some announcements. As always, in consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phones. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors, whose generous financial support make these City Club luncheons possible. Please join me in offering an appreciative round of applause to our spring quarter sponsors, Key Private Bank, Northwest Natural, and Schwabe Williamson & Wyatt. "60 years ago, City Club was instrumental in the creation of Forest Park. This beloved park today faces an accumulation of financial, administrative, and environmental challenges. Next week, on May 20th, City Club will be releasing a new Forest Park research report, which makes recommendations for addressing these challenges. We will also be hosting an informational town hall to learn more about the report's findings and recommendations on May 26th. And then on June 4th, at our City Club annual meeting, we invite you to join us for a debate and interactive discussion about this report. We hope to see you all there. Next week, City Club welcomes two heart health experts who will discuss why the occurrence of heart disease in Oregon is among the worst in the nation and share how they propose to reverse the trend. And now to today's program. Nuclear power generation is attracting renewed attention worldwide. Developing nations such as China and India are focusing on nuclear power in their quest for new energy sources. Developed nations, already consumers of large amounts of energy, need more for growing demand and replacement of plants that emit carbon dioxide. Today we welcome Paul Lorenzini. In 1970, after earning his PhD in nuclear engineering from Oregon State University, Paul joined Atomics International, where he developed safety analysis codes for a kind of nuclear reactor. During this period, he also attended law school, receiving his JD from Loyola University in Los Angeles. In 1979, Dr. Lorenzini joined the staff of Rockwell International, the largest contractor at the Hanford Nuclear Defense Complex in eastern Washington. He eventually became Rockwell's vice president and general manager, a position he held until 1987. Paul then spent 13 years in several executive management positions at PacifiCorp, an electric utility based here in Portland. Paul is now the chief executive officer of NuScale Power, an Oregon corporation formed in 2007. NuScale Power is seeking to commercialize a small nuclear reactor design developed at Oregon State University. And now, please help me welcome to the stage today's speaker, Paul Lorenzini. Paul?
Thank you, Sue. I have to say that as I reflect on being here today, my first thought is how much things have changed. As somebody gently pointed out to me, nuclear power has been the Darth Vader of energy policy for the last 3 or 4 decades. And yet what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years is a significant shift in attitudes toward nuclear power, as Sue indicated. Right now there are 54 nuclear plants under construction in various parts of the world, one of those in the United States. So we've seen a shift in opinion polls. It's gone to the point that today over 70% of the people are comfortable with believing that nuclear power needs to be part of the energy mix. So we've seen shifts with environmentalists. James Lovelock, author of the Gaia Principle, Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, Stuart Brand, known for the Whole Earth Catalog, all very well-known environmentalists, have come out in favor of nuclear power. A year ago, one environmental journalist, his name is Eric Wessoff with Green Tech Media, he put it this way, and it kind of summed it up for a lot of people. He said, "I'm a knee-jerk environmentalist, and I have a visceral response to the word nuclear, but the more I learn and read, the more experts I speak with, the more my mind is changed. Nuclear is a necessary part of the energy mix." And that last part is important. It's a part of the energy mix. It's not nuclear power versus conservation or nuclear power versus renewables. It's nuclear power as one part of a comprehensive energy mix. In February, the Oregonian had an editorial, and they referred to Oregon's no-how, no-way position on nuclear power and suggested it's time to rethink it. So why has the shift occurred? Well, clearly, the main reason has been the concern for climate change and the need for non-carbon sources of energy. And if you look at capacity additions over the last few years to the electric grid, you can start to see why. Most of it has been gas. From the period 1990 to 1999, out of 90 gigawatts added to the U.S. grid. Now, a gigawatt is about one plant the size of Trojan, just so you can be calibrated here. Out of 90 gigawatts added to the grid, about 62, or roughly 70%, was natural gas. Another 20% was coal and nuclear power. But as you know, we had a kind of capacity crisis in the year 2000. You saw the brownouts in California, but it was really a national situation. So during the next 5 years, from 2000 to 2005, we added 222 gigawatts to the grid. So that's 90 versus 220. And because we had to do it in kind of a crash program, about 97% of that was natural gas. And by the way, 222 was as much new capacity as we added to the grid during the entire period from 1983 to 1999. So that gives you a sense of the kind of situation we found ourselves in. Wind has started to make some headway. In 2006, 21% of the new capacity added was wind, but still 77% was gas. Now, natural gas is better than coal, but if you're concerned about carbon, it's still not a very good answer. It kind of drafts behind carbon. We know that gas produces less carbon than coal, but we often overlook the fact that it's still a major carbon producer. While coal produces a little more than 1,000 tons of CO2 for every gigawatt hour produced. Gigawatt hour is 1,000 megawatts running for an hour. So coal produces about 1,000 tons for every gigawatt hour produced. Gas produces over 600 tons per gigawatt. And if you compare that with geothermal, nuclear, wind, they're all less than 20. So 1,000 plus 600 less than 20. So as we look at the future, we need to look for non-carbon sources, and we can't really consider gas as part of a sustainable climate change policy. So where do we look? Well, clearly we're looking at renewables. So wind has played a very key role here in the Northwest and in other parts of the country, but it also has its limitations. As we know, it only works when the wind blows. And you can see that as you look at the wind generation patterns on the Bonneville Power Administration grid. They've got about 2,500 megawatts of wind as we speak, maybe more than that, I'm not sure. In 2008, it was about 1,500 megawatts. And what they do on the BPA grid, you can go to their website, and every 5 minutes, they have a rolling average of the last 7 days, and you can see what the rolling average has been. It's updated every 5 minutes. And what you can see is the pattern. And you can see the wind generation going like this, and sometimes it's pretty good. Sometimes it goes for days when it doesn't generate very much. If you look at 2008, for more than 40% of the time, it operated at less than 20% capacity. So what happens when you put wind on a system is you have to make up for those periods of time when it's not operating. Now, that can work well in the Northwest where we have hydropower. So wind isn't operating, you put more water through the dams and you can make it up. So that works pretty well. In other parts of the country, it's not so simple. In places like Texas, for example, they build gas generating facilities to provide electricity when the wind isn't blowing, which has its own carbon and cost implications. So what we need to complement resources such as wind is what utilities refer to as baseload energy, energy that operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And there are really only three major sources of baseload energy: coal, gas, and nuclear power. And two of the three produce large amounts of carbon. Now you could put oil in there, I suppose, but I don't know if anybody wants to use oil to make electricity. You could throw geothermal in, or biomass to some extent, but there isn't enough from either of those sources to make the kind of difference we're talking about. So that's the picture people see when they're concerned about climate change and they begin to rethink their position on nuclear power. Now, it's one thing for the Bush administration to support nuclear power. They supported nuclear power during the Bush administration. But the question when President Obama was elected was what is he going to do and what is he going to say about it? And we got our first signal there when he appointed Stephen Chu, Dr. Stephen Chu, as his head of the Department of Energy. his Secretary of Energy, and during his confirmation hearings, he clarified the position. He said nuclear power is going to be an important part of our energy mix. It's 20% of our electricity generation today, but it is 70% of the carbon-free portion of electricity today, and it is base load. So I think it is very important that we push ahead. Now, that 70% number kind of caught people by surprise because they hadn't thought about it in that way, but it's an important part of looking at this. And he also mentioned the importance of base load. Now, all that being said, there are other considerations that have influenced this shift as well. There are 104 nuclear plants operating in this country, and they've been running pretty well. Capacity factors have routinely exceeded 90% for well over the last decade, which means they operate continuously 90% of the time. The regulatory process has been modernized, so that's encouraged standardized designs. And think back during the 70s, every nuclear plant was different, so standardized designs is one way to make them more efficient, cost-effective. The new generation of plants have what is referred to as passive safety systems, which means operators don't have to do anything. They can walk away, and it can be safely cooled for up to 3 days. So passive safety. And so you've got sort of old nuclear and new nuclear, and so nuclear has made some changes. They've got these standardized designs, regulatory process, passive safety. All that being said, there are two areas where we've seen less progress, and one is, of course, the issue of waste disposal. It's a difficult, nagging, and frankly frustrating issue. For those of you that have maybe been on another planet for the last couple of decades, nuclear waste is a product of producing power from nuclear energy. And I was asked to give a primer on how do we get energy from nuclear power. So just real quickly, what happens is you have uranium atoms that fission, split in two, and when they split in two, they generate a large amount of energy. And when they do that, the byproducts, those two pieces that are left, are very often radioactive. And so that's called fission products, and that's where the radioactive waste comes from. So the question is, most of that radioactivity, especially from the fission products, decays away pretty significantly over the first couple, 300 years. Longer term, there are small remnants of material that come from uranium atoms that get radioactive in other ways. And so that remains radioactive for thousands of years. And so the constant issue is, what are we going to do with it? Well, one of the first questions that I get asked when this comes up is, well, what are you doing with it now? And right now, wastes are stored at plant sites where the waste was generated. In the first few years, it's stored in pools of water. As the radioactivity decays, it can eventually be removed from the pools, typically after about 10 years, where it is stored above ground in dry casks. These are large reinforced concrete blocks, and they're air-cooled, which means that air cooling is sufficient to keep them cool. And there it sits. It's a big block. It's not liquid. It's not under pressure. It's not mobile. You can stand right next to it and touch it. It just sits there. So how much is there? Well, if the used fuel assemblies from all the nuclear power operations over the last 40 years were stacked end to end and side by side, they'd cover a football field about 7 yards deep. Well, that's because nuclear energy is very energy dense. It produces a lot of energy with not very much resource. When you split that atom, you get a whole lot of energy from it. And just one kind of factoid, a pound of uranium has the energy potential of about 1 million pounds of coal. So you think about refueling a nuclear plant, it's once every 18 months. Think about refueling a coal plant, it's 80 boxcars, hopper cars of coal every day. So that's where we stand right now. So the question is, what are we going to do about it long term? Greg Jasko, the current chair of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, has stated that the NRC does not believe there's any public safety concern with continuing to store waste in this form for another 50 to 100 years. And in saying that, he reflects the view that is adopted by the Obama administration in abandoning the site at Yucca Mountain. And in fact, there's some advantages to that kind of delay. During the first 100 years, the heat generated by the fuel drops because radioactivity decays. And if you look at designing a waste repository, getting rid of that heat during the early years is one of the design issues, so you solve that problem. And secondly, Mini-C spent fuel as a resource, either because it contains fuel or because some of the other materials have commercial and industrial uses. So delaying the repository gives additional time to consider alternatives for recovering those resources. But no question, there's a need to reach some kind of closure on what the long-term solution is going to be. So for years, scientists and engineers have consistently believed that we can store these wastes safely and permanently underground in geologic repositories. So that's been the focus. And they've actually been collecting money from customers of nuclear utilities. So the federal government has collected about $25 billion to pay for that kind of a repository. Now, out of that, they've spent about $9 billion, so they've got a whole lot left over. So it's not been a funding issue. It's really been an issue of finding a willing partner. Nevada wasn't a particularly willing partner. So as I indicated, President Obama has made the decision to abandon that site. And so what he's done is he's forming a blue ribbon committee to propose a path forward. And at this point, we simply need to see where that's going to take us. Meanwhile, the wastes are safely stored where they are. So, how do these leading environmentalists who have made the shift, how do they address this issue and how do they reconcile themselves to this problem? Stuart Brand is typical. He was on the Stephen Colbert show in the last couple of weeks and started out, he says, look, global warming changed everything for me, and it means we have to take a fresh look at non-carbon sources of energy, particularly nuclear power. And as he puts it, when he talks about waste, he says it's not very much, it's safe where it is, it's controlled, and that makes it a whole lot better than the tons of waste we don't control and we spew into the air from other resources. So, one man's view. So I spent some time on the waste issue because that's one of the first questions that people ask, but I indicated there's a second issue, and that's the issue of size. As Al Gore so eloquently put it, nuclear plants come in only one size, big. And all larger than 1,000 megawatts, some as high as 1,700 megawatts. 1,000 megawatts, again, to calibrate, is about the size of the Trojan plant. And the problem that creates is financial risk. You have to put up a lot of money to fund the building of these plants. And the amounts of money are really pretty large compared to the capitalization of these companies. Some of the largest utilities in the country are building nuclear projects, and the amount of money they have to invest represents up to 50% of the total capitalization of the company. So it's a big financial challenge. As one utility executive put it to me, he said, look, when I look at building a large twin 1,000 megawatt generating project, I'm looking at $10 to $12 billion, and he says that's money that's going to be at risk for 10 to 12 years. That's 3 presidential administrations, and who knows what's going to happen during that kind of period of time. And then he looked at me and says, and who knows, maybe the life of 2 popes. So that's caused people to look in another direction. How can we look at building nuclear plants where we don't have to take that kind of financial risk? And that's caused people to start looking at small reactors. Now, small reactors have been around for a long time. There are about 95 different designs of small reactors in various parts of the world. And they were developed and always thought of for remote locations and developing countries where you don't have large grids. But what's new is the idea of taking small reactors and clustering them together and offering them to utilities that may want a large amount of energy, and they get it by clustering a number of these small reactors together. And secondly, what's made it possible is the possibility of doing that economically. For the last 4 decades, it's kind of in the nuclear DNA that in order to be economic, you have to build big plants. That's why all these plants are as big as they are, and they capture what they call the economies of scale. So what we are trying to do is capture what we're calling the economies of small. If you start with a clean white piece of paper and you say, how can I make a small plant and make it economically, what would it look like? And it turns out that we think we can put a plant together that can be economic in that kind of situation. So what are the economic advantages? Well, first of all, the entire plant's manufactured in a factory. So you get the advantages of factory manufacturing, and you get the advantages of mass production. You get the advantages of controlling your construction costs. You can add new capacity in increments, so you don't have to build the whole plant all at once. The plants are very, very simple, and I'll talk about our plant to give you an idea of what we mean by that, but what you get out of simplicity is you eliminate equipment and you get enhanced safety. Because they're smaller, you don't have to go to some of these international fabricators, so it can be manufactured in the U.S., so it creates U.S. jobs. And you can reach markets that the big plants can't reach because they're so big. So let me talk about what we mean by a small reactor and do it by talking specifically about the plant that we're developing at NuScale Power. Just a little history. Why Oregon State and how did Oregon State get into this in the first place? If you go back to the early 1990s when vendors started thinking about where nuclear power was going to go next, and they said, we want to develop this so-called passive safety, they needed test facilities to demonstrate how it would work. Turned out Oregon State was the place that built the test facility that was used to license the Westinghouse 1,000-megawatt plant that's commercial today. It's the only university in the country that's used to develop designs and test facilities to certify nuclear power plants. So based on that, the Department of Energy came to Oregon State in 2000 and asked them to do a study on developing a small reactor that took advantage of some of the lessons that they learned from developing these test facilities. So they designed a plant. They called it the Multi-Application Small Light Water Reactor. We changed the name to NuScale for obvious reasons. They completed that study in 2003. It included the construction of an integral test facility. And then we formed our company in 2007. They sort of worked on the design during that period of time, made improvements to it. So we formed our company in 2007, and we went to the market in 2008. We have a technology transfer agreement with the Oregon State University so that we collectively own that. They have equity in the company, and we own the technology. So how small is small? Well, each of our nuclear plants, now imagine in your mind this kind of steel shell, 65 feet long by 14 feet in diameter. That's the containment. That's the outer shell. Inside that is a pressure vessel, and inside that is the nuclear plant. It stands vertically, and the nuclear plant is at the bottom where we generate heat. That whole thing, 65 feet by 14 feet, is manufactured off-site in a factory. And we've identified 4 or 5 different manufacturers. One is right here in Portland, Oregon Iron Works, that can make it. It's transported to the site by rail, truck, or barge. I was asked to address this specifically to Ray Polani, but he's not here. But we do transport by rail. People worry about, nuclear plants sort of transported all over the country. Well, we load the fuel at the plant. So the fuel it's not a loaded operating nuclear plant. The fuel is not loaded till it gets to the plant. It's entirely cooled by natural circulation. So what that means, imagine in your mind, you've got a reactor at the bottom, heats up the water, hot water rises, gets to the top, comes down around the outside where it goes over a steam generator, cool water sinks, and so you get this natural circulation of water, no pumps, no pipes, no valves. So no pumps to buy, no pumps to fail, no pipes to fail, no valves to buy, no electrical system to have to purchase. So we get the economic advantage of not having all of that system and equipment, and we also get the safety advantage of eliminating a number of accident scenarios that you have to deal with when you have pumps and pipes and valves. So we get safety advantages and we get economic advantages. It's proven technology, light water technology. We've got the prototype facility in Corvallis, electrically heated, 1/3 scale, but what it demonstrates is how the flows work and how the safety systems work. It's below grade, so you can imagine this cylindrical reactor, and it now sits below grade in a pool of water. So the pool of water provides a heat sink. It provides stability from seismic events. It's below grade for security reasons. And so we get security, we get safety for that, and we get the economies. Produces about 45 megawatts each. So how much is 45 megawatts? Well, it takes 10 45 megawatt units to produce the power of one Boardman plant. It takes 20 to produce the power of one Trojan plant. On the other hand, if you compare it to wind, it produces the energy equivalent of about anywhere from 36 to 110 wind units, depending on how large the wind units are. So that gives you some sense of how big 45 megawatts is. I talked about the safety. We've actually had 2 independent expert safety panels review the design, and what they've confirmed is that we've eliminated what's called the large break loss of coolant accident. That's the big one that large plants are designed to protect against. They have to put an emergency core cooling system in for it and all of these other things. We don't have to do any of that stuff. When we look at small break loss of coolant accidents, we can't find scenarios that uncover the core, so it's very, very safe from that standpoint. We've conducted a probabilistic risk assessment. Now, what is that? That's an analysis where you go through all the different ways things can go wrong and you look at what the probabilities are. And so the NRC has a goal that says that you can't have any accident leading to damage to your core more frequently than once every 10,000 years. So current plants, they're about anywhere from 100,000 up. The next generation of plants, these passive plants, they're more like 100, let's see, 10 to the minus 7. That's about once every million years. We're down to 10 to the minus 8, so we're about once every 10 million years. So you can always make things safer, so we feel like we've made huge steps forward in terms of reducing any scenario that could cause an accident. But I also know, that there's somebody out here thinking to themselves, I don't care what the probability is, I don't want it to happen at all. And so the other thing that we have is, if you imagine this containment sitting inside a pool of water, we not only have the traditional barriers of safety, the fuel pellet and then the pressure vessel and the containment. Outside the containment, it now sits in a pool of water, so if anything gets out of the containment, it goes to this pool of water. Pool of water is in a stainless steel concrete structure, so now you got stainless steel, and then you got another reactor building around that. We believe that we're going to be able to show that we have a real hard time coming up with any off-site releases from anything that could happen in our plant. The modularity permits us to scale the plant, so imagine this pool of water. Imagine building a great big swimming pool. That's what our reactor building looks like, and it's got places where we can put up to 12 of these units. So you put them in one at a time, each one generates 45, you put 12 in, you get 540 megawatts. So that's the plant we're seeking to license, and that's the plant that we're taking to the marketplace. And if you look at how we would build that plant, we actually have a way where we could build half the plant for the first 270 megawatts. Now, that's about the size of typical gas units. So what that allows us to do for customers is that instead of having to build 1,000 or 2,000 megawatt units to get to an economic plant, they can build a plant for 270 megawatts or 1,000 or 500 megawatts, much smaller, less financial risk, less financial exposure. And because we build our plant in a factory, we have much more control over our costs, and we're much more able to predict what our costs are going to be. If you imagine in your mind building a nuclear plant and all the cranes and workers and all those individuals that are part of building the nuclear plant at the site, and then imagine just taking it off-site, it's all gone, and the plant comes up on a truck. What's left is building this reactor building and the peripheral materials. Our partner Kiewit says that they believe building that plant is going to be simpler than building a coal plant. So we get all these construction advantages. One downside is, we talked to one customer, and they've got a lot of workers in their community, and they wondered, how many workers is this going to employ? And we said, well, typical nuclear plant, it peaks out at 2,000 or 3,000 workers. We're going to peak out at about 500 workers. And they were kind of disappointed, but on the other hand, the economics work. And what we do create is we create manufacturing jobs that are stable jobs with all these companies that are manufacturing our modules. So we create different kinds of jobs. So the advantages, we get factory manufacturing, we get the natural circulation cooling, we get proven light water technology, seismically robust because it's underground in a pool of water. We get a lot of dampening, so we think we can go to locations seismically that are more difficult for the bigger plants to go to. We've validated our economics with cost estimates by our partners. They've gone through a complete bottoms-up cost estimate, counting the rungs on all the ladders and all these different things. So we've got a number that we're pretty comfortable is a very competitive number. So what's happened in the conversation about nuclear power? We started talking about this small concept in 2007 and 2008, and I can remember talking to some colleagues, and they just, they were shaking their head that, like, we had smoked something, and they said, nobody is going to do this. I know what these big utilities look for, and nobody's going to buy one of these small reactors. Well, then we got an article in Popular Mechanics in the middle of the year, and we got a couple of other articles. We started having meetings with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. And then last year, Babcock and Wilcox came out with their version of a small reactor, and now you've got a credible large company saying that they think this is a viable market too, and the thing is just taken off. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has created a special branch to license our plant and the B&W plant. There's bipartisan legislation that's been offered co-sponsored by Mark Udall, by Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, Senator Bingaman, Murkowski, Webb. There are 3 different bills working their way through the Congress, all aimed at providing financial support and legislative support for small nuclear plants. There was a hearing in December. If you go to major industries now in the nuclear industry, they're all focusing on small reactors and how small reactors have changed the conversation. We had an article in the New York Times, half-a-page spread, and this is how it's happening to us. We aren't out there really trying to push our name, but we're going back to a meeting in Washington in September, and one of our employees is sitting next to a New York Times reporter and started talking to her about this plant. She got all excited, and we wound up with a half-a-page article in the New York Times. Wall Street Journal, National Geographic earlier this month, Discovery Magazine. In March, you've got Secretary Chu with an op-ed piece in the Wall Street Journal. He says, if we're serious about cutting carbon pollution, then nuclear power must be part of the solution. Countries such as China, South Korea, and India have recognized this and are making investments in nuclear power that are driving the demand for nuclear technologies. Our choice is clear: develop these technologies today or import them tomorrow. That's why, even as we build a new generation of clean and safe nuclear plants, we're constantly looking ahead to the future of nuclear power. As this paper in the Wall Street Journal recently reported, one of the most promising areas is small modular reactors. If we can develop this technology in the U.S. and build these reactors with American workers, we will have a key competitive edge. And so you see that sort of thing going on. Then you see the other things happening. We had Green Tech Media, I mentioned them earlier. They came out with their list of top 10, what they called high concepts for 2009. Number one on their list was modular nuclear power plants. They came out with their list of top 50 green startup companies, and we were on the list. The only nuclear company on the list and the only green company from Oregon on the list. You also have a little bit more different stuff happening. We're getting a lot of international interest. We're getting interest from countries like Jordan, the Philippines, and so forth. I had a conversation with somebody from Uganda. This was about 2 years ago in a hotel in New York. And he was a developer and said, gee, this looks like something would be really good for Uganda. He said, we'd like to come visit you. So we set up a meeting in April. And in March, I got a Reuters release that said the president of Uganda had directed his parliament to develop a regulatory framework so they could build small nuclear plants in Uganda. And so the guy came to see me in April, and I said, this is pretty timely, look at this article. And he looked at me and says, do you know how that happened? After I met with you, I went back and I met with the president of Uganda. He got excited about your plant, and he directed the parliament to put a procedure in place so we could build your plant in Uganda. Now, it's going to be a long time before one of our plants goes into Uganda, because the International Atomic Energy Commission has a process that requires countries to go through a very rigorous set of steps to demonstrate that they can build one of these nuclear plants. So it takes about 15 years to implement all the steps in that process and put the infrastructure in place. But it's a nice conversation to have, and it reflects the way people are thinking about the way this market is moving. So with that, let me close and answer any questions you've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our City Club host. Our host today is Tom Iverson. Tom is the Fish and Wildlife Program Coordinator for the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Authority. Tom has been a member of the Board of Governors and the Research Board for the past 2 years and is currently the Research Board Chair. He has served on 2 ballot measure studies and has been a City Club member since 2004. Tom?
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Paul. I think it's very intriguing building small-scale nuclear. You talked about 2 things that there's been little progress on in nuclear power development over the last few years. One was waste disposal, and I didn't directly hear the second. And what I thought you were going to say is public perception of nuclear safety in construction and managing nuclear power plants. And so I'd like to talk just a little bit about. I think we're getting clear signals from politicians that we need to be considering nuclear power, and we're certainly seeing it around the world, its acceptance and implementation. But sort of within our country, is there still pushback? It seems like it's been a long time since we built a power plant. There's one going up in Georgia. How did they overcome the hurdles of public perception and construction? And do you see more of a proliferation within the U.S., say, in the next 15, 20 years?
Well, actually, the second one was size. But to answer your question, we've seen a shift in attitudes. We've seen, if you go back to 1986, after Chernobyl, it was down around 40%. People were very uncomfortable with it. Over time, they've gotten more and more comfortable with it. So today, the polls show 70 to 75% are comfortable with moving forward with nuclear power. Doesn't mean 100%. There are still people who have been uncomfortable with it for a long time and are still uncomfortable with it. That's part of the process of public dialogue and public debate. I think it's influenced by the fact that We've got these plants that continue to run, and they run very, very well, and they run very, very safely, not only in this country, but throughout the world. I talked about the capacity factor. If you go back to the 70s and 80s, they ran 60, 70%. It wasn't until the early 1990s that they started to really move up. The capacity factor is an indicator just that they run without being stopped by inadvertent shutdowns and other things that aren't working right. So the 90% capacity factor is one of those indicators. And so, it's comfort with time, it's comfort with designs, and I think people are just beginning to realize that these plants can run safely. So we're not all the way there. I will tell you that I talked to Eric Wessoff from Green Tech Media this week as it happens, and he talked about their decision to put NuScale Power on their list of top 50 green startups, and he said it didn't get to fisticuffs when they made the decision, but it was close. So even within their organization, there are both sides, and both sides are out there. But what I think the significance of what you're seeing, in my view, is when you see people that are long-term environmentalists starting to move, it says that something's happening in the way people are looking at nuclear power.
We'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership. So if you could identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less.
Matteo Luccio, City Club member. Thank you for an excellent presentation. Could you talk briefly about what conditions or locations and countries these small plants are particularly suited for? So, for example, big countries like China, where of course coal is a big problem, would this be part of the solution there, or is it more appropriate for different kinds of, smaller, developing countries and so forth?
Actually, let me answer that in part by answering part of your question as well. One of the things we're seeing is that where nuclear plants are being built, they're being built at sites where other plants already exist. And so they're being built in communities that are already familiar with and comfortable with nuclear power. And so that's a part of what's been involved in the public acceptance. The market that we're going after right now is a domestic utility market. And we're talking to people who are like that, who have got existing plants and existing approved sites. But there are other customers. We were approached by Tinian. Tinian is a small island in the South Pacific. They've got a 70 megawatt load. It's about mostly hotels and resorts. Their annual fuel bill is $80 million for diesel fuel, which is polluting and very expensive and unreliable. So they like the idea of putting a 2-unit nuclear plant in Tinian. We've got conversations just getting started with the Philippines, where they've got a lot of smaller islands, and the idea of, and in a lot of these places, getting fuel in and out is difficult, whether it's liquid natural gas or coal. So being able to put a facility there that you don't have to refuel very often is very attractive. So countries like that. We were invited to China a year ago in August, the province of Chengdu, and they had looked at small nuclear plants in various designs. They liked ours, and they invited us on their nickel. We flew first class, so it was great. We spent 3 days with some officials from the Chengdu province talking to them about how a small nuclear plant that we would design would fit and be suitable for them. Part of what they liked is Chengdu is in a high seismic area close to the area where they had the big earthquake, and so they liked the idea of a plant that's robust from a seismic standpoint. So I understand you're a guy to have a drink with, a beer with.
And I believe we have had beer together.
That's right.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Paul, when I've asked some energy geeks about nuclear power in general, they've said it's way too expensive. And so I was curious if you could tell us, based on whatever assumptions you're making about construction costs, life of the plants, et cetera, how do you think the cost per kilowatt hour of your plants might compare to, say, coal, solar, wind, et cetera?
If you compare us to coal and gas, we're more expensive until you factor in carbon sequestration costs or carbon recovery costs, and it's or a carbon tax. And it's when you put those things into the mix that the economics change. So what we compare ourselves to is the big nuclear plants. And the big nuclear plants, they started out a couple of years ago with some very optimistic numbers. Those numbers have gone up. So what we're trying to do is do our cost estimates in a way that we understand what caused those estimates to go up and make sure that doesn't happen to us. So we've got a partner, Peter Kiewit Construction, and they're developing a very comprehensive balance of plant design, and they're counting in all the things that, typically in the old days, a nuclear vendor would look at the nuclear plant, and they'd have that part pretty down, but then you got out to the balance of plant areas, and that's where the costs kind of lost control. So we're trying to get that under control, and we're trying to put a structure around it that would allow us to go to customers and make some pretty strong price commitments. The other part of it is the fact that we build our nuclear plant in a factory gives us much better control over how much it's going to cost, a much better ability to understand that, and a much better ability to control that as we go forward. Greg.
Yeah, Paul, I'm Greg Kafuri. I want to comment first that you spoke of the virtues of debate. I know we don't have one here. And when I passed out some literature on the subject, I was told I couldn't do it because it amounted to electioneering. I said, there's no election. We have plenty of people in Oregon who could respond to you, but they don't have the opportunity, and that's not to the City Club's credit. The last time we had a nuclear speaker here, we were told that Chernobyl killed 31 people, and the number from the latest study of 5,000 studies combined says it's now up to 1 million dead. But what I wanted to ask you about is the one thing you didn't mention, which is taxpayer subsidies. Isn't it a fact that the banks have refused to put up nickel one for any of these nuclear plants unless they have essentially a 100% federal guarantee that no matter what happens, if these plants are never built, if they never run, if they die early, that the banks get all their money back and the taxpayers are going to be expected to underwrite all of that? And also, isn't it a fact that even with your plants, all these plants are insisting on about 90% relief from liability? That is, if the thing has a disaster, you guys are not on the hook for more than pennies on a dollar. Aren't those both facts?
No. So let me start with Chernobyl. I wrote an article on this, by the way, in the American Spectator. You can look it up under Chernobyl myths. There's the most reputable group that has looked at the impact of Chernobyl is the Chernobyl Forum. Chernobyl Forum consists of all the countries in Russia, plus the United Nations health agencies. Their number was, the immediate fatalities was about the number you said. They're predicting, if you look at long-term impacts, as much as maybe 2,000, 5,000, something like that. Nobody is seriously talking about a number like you gave. So let me just say that. Secondly, as far as loan guarantees are concerned, if you look at loan guarantees, there are loan guarantees being offered for renewables, about $78 million, about $18 million for nuclear. Nuclear loan guarantees are the only loan guarantees where the recipient has to pay a subsidy fee. So if you're a nuclear utility and you get a loan guarantee, you're making a payment of about $300 to $400 million in cash at the front end that isn't financed to pay for that loan guarantee. But the other thing I would say in response to your question, nobody's willing to do it. And I can give you the data. I got a survey from a financial analyst I spoke to this week. 48% of the financial analysts that he talked to said they'd be willing to finance a nuclear plant without a loan guarantee. And I think what you're going to see is the loan guarantees are getting so difficult to get approved that nuclear plants are going to have to be built without loan guarantees. In our case, we don't think we're going to require one. So it's a different.
There's not one that's being built now without loan guarantees, is there?
Well, there's only one being built, you know.
And the one in Texas is $4 billion over budget already?
Yes.
Chris Almond, City Club member. You've reassured us regarding the safety and regulation of nuclear energy industry. Of course, we've heard that in regards to the offshore oil drilling. In the beginning of the month, ProPublica just came out with an investigational reporting that at Hanford, there was a whistleblower case where employees were being discouraged about reporting of beryllium exposure. Beryllium can cause an acute and chronic disease. The chronic disease can present as late as 20 to 30 years, thus meaning regulation, even while it's there, may be undermined in regards to the pressure in the workplace. And I would like you to comment on how we are going to feel adequately insured with the potential liability of nuclear energy?
Well, I can't speak to the beryllium. What I can say is that I'm not sure they have beryllium at Hanford. They have beryllium at Rocky Flats. So I'm not sure what the beryllium would be doing at Hanford, but be that as it may, the whole issue of whistleblowers has been around for a long time, and there's been a lot of procedures put in place to make sure people have the freedom to make whatever claims they can. I can't say any more to that because I'm not familiar with the facts at Hanford. What I can say, though, is that within the nuclear industry and within the NRC, there's something they emphasize called safety culture. The idea is that you can't regulate safety in all by yourself. You have to have management that's committed to safety. You have to have a company that's committed to safety, and it has to be reflected in the culture of the workers. And frankly, that was something that was realized more after 3 Mile Island. After 3 Mile Island, you still had the NRC, but there was another group called the Institute for Nuclear Power Operations that was formed, made up of industry people for the purpose of self-regulation and to focus on what they needed to do as an industry to build this safety culture into the way nuclear plants ran. And you saw interesting things. The INPO now goes out and they do these inspections and they have these standards, they have these awards they give. If there's a plant that isn't running very well, it's not just a matter of them getting a nasty report from INPO. The CEO will typically get a visit from 4 or 5 other CEOs in the nuclear industry, and they close the door and you have real unpleasant conversations because everybody knows that one bad nuclear plant is going to make it difficult for the entire industry. So within the industry, there is a tremendous incentive to run plants safe and to build a safety culture within the industry. And it's also something that the NRC expects and pays a lot of attention to. So safety is not just a matter of having a strong regulator with a lot of fines. It's a matter of how you operate your company and how you build that culture into the company and into the way you do things on a day-to-day basis. Yes?
Yes, Judith Barnes, City Club member. As a ratepayer and a taxpayer, I think the question we all need to be asking ourselves, since we are the ones who are going to be funding whatever this transition to a non-CO2 based energy economy is, where is the best place for us to put our money? Because ultimately it's taxpayers and ratepayers who have to pay the bill. Where is the best place for us to spend the money? And my question is, I think one of the reasons why environmentalists are looking at nuclear energy, yes, it doesn't reduce to CO2 emissions, but it does emit radioactivity in some form. That's the fear that we can't more quickly enough move to other sources. There are other sources of energy. They're called the sun and the wind. And my question is, what would be your comment about the proposal that what we really need in order to transition is a WPA-like program for weatherization and energy efficiency, plus rapid and massive deployment of solar and wind by paying people to generate renewable energy at the local level. This is being done very successfully in Europe with something called feed-in tariff policies. It produces widespread, decentralized renewable energy production with jobs and job opportunities for training jobs, job training opportunities in local communities, reaping enormous benefits all over the built environment. Why isn't that the best place for us to be spending our taxpayer and ratepayer dollars? Thank you.
Well, it's one place to be spending it, and people have been spending a lot of money in those areas for the last 20 years. They've been especially spending it in recent years. It's interesting, in the business that we're starting, we're talking to venture capitalists, and there's billions of dollars being invested in solar power by venture capitalists. There aren't very many of those companies that have been profitable because solar is very, very expensive and it's intermittent. And it doesn't have the energy density. It's got the intermittency issue. You've got that issue with all these different renewables, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be focusing on it. We should. I talked earlier about the need for a comprehensive energy mix, but it's an energy mix. We need a little bit of everything, and in that mix, you need some baseload energy that runs 24/7. The reason that during the period 2000 to 2005, 95% was gas is because gas is baseload, and it's something that you can get up and you can get running quickly. So, I mean, that's the best answer I can give you. Yes, sir.
Yes. Ethan Scarl, City Club member. I'd like to extend Judy's question a little bit. She asked about cost, but the other the critical factor in reducing our CO2 footprint is timeline. And so I would ask you, given, say, pick a number, $25 billion public investment as a loan guarantee or straight out investment, and given economies of scale, what I'd like to see is two graphs. I know you're not in a position to show graphs here, but a graph of versus time, what, for that investment, what would the return be in megawatt production, say, from a nuclear program versus from renewables? I think that would be critical for our decision making.
Yeah, well, let me just make this one comment. You know, our company is funded almost entirely by venture capitalists. The government's talking about putting together a cost-sharing program. Out of that cost-sharing program, we might get $10 million next year. So, you know, the amount of money that would make a big, big difference for us on the scale of the numbers that are being spent on these other technologies is very, very small. And yet we've got investors spending money in our company because they believe that we've got a product that's going to reach the marketplace and be competitive without all these federal subsidies and help aids that people are used to seeing. If you look at a timeline, we believe that we could have a plant up and running by 2018, 2019, 2020. That's our timeline. And by the way, the other thing that's an advantage for modular reactors is because it's factory built and because the on-site construction is as simple as it is, it's about 3 years from the time of the first concrete pour to getting the first generation up and running. Yes?
Yes, Muriel Lezak, member. I'm still concerned about the issue of waste.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us what France does with its waste, what's going on in Europe in terms of waste? Where they're putting it and how it's working?
Well, France for years has been reprocessing their waste, and to be honest with you, I am not that conversant on what's going on in other countries. What does interest me is there are countries like Sweden that's developing a repository, Switzerland. Very small countries are finding repository locations that are difficult for us to find in a country as big as ours. And one of the things that you see is in countries like Sweden, there's nobody between the federal government and the local government. The same is true in Switzerland. And in our country, what we see is you've got the federal governments, the states, and the local governments. In the 80s, they were looking at 3 sites for a repository, one in Richland, one in Texas, and one in Nevada. In each case, the local community was not opposed. Even in Nevada, the local community was neutral, didn't take a position. It's the state level where the political resistance comes in our country, and that really complicates the politics. You're shaking your head. What am I not answering? And my answer is I don't know. I mean, all the countries that I talked about are looking at geologic repositories, but I can't give you the answer to the status of that in each country. I just don't know. Other than they're probably just keeping it like we are at plant sites until they do that. Yes.
Kurt Wavering, member. You mentioned the interest of Uganda in having a plant of this sort. It makes me think that there might be other countries who might be very politically unstable. If you had a proliferation of these plants as well as personnel who understand how to manufacture and operate nuclear facilities, isn't there a danger that what started as a peaceful use might then become a military use of nuclear?
Yeah, that's a big issue. People talk a lot about that. When I said that it would take Uganda 15 years to go through an IAEA process, part of that is to develop an infrastructure and a relationship with the IAEA specifically to assure that not only can they operate their plants safely, but that issues related to proliferation are identified and managed. That's going to be an issue with the development of nuclear power in other countries, and that's the International Atomic Energy Agency is a big part of managing that. That's I really you're not going to go into Uganda tomorrow and put up a nuclear power plant, and stability of the government is one of the things that they look at. Yes, sir.
Rick Williams, member and a retired submarine captain. You address quality control, which the factory will do. Another aspect of that is the crews. I operated 6 modular reactors during my career, including one natural circulation and one that I had command of under the under the North Pole. Where are we going to get the people? How are they going to be qualified? And how many family wage jobs would we expect for the size of plant, the small size that you're talking about?
Well, our plant would require about 300 people to staff it. About 70 of those people are there for security. So that's security guards. So you take them out and that changes the profile. Actually, word about Oregon State. The reason Oregon State kept a nuclear program alive is that back in the 60s and 70s, they were developing PhDs and master's degrees, and when the nuclear program started to go down, Oregon State began to focus on a program to train people to be operators. And so they had a really strong program. I think you'll see more of that. There are a lot of people focused on what's needed to develop the workforce, not only to run these plants, but also the construction workforce to build them. So that's a huge, huge issue that the industry is facing today. Yes.
Elsa Porter, City Club member. My question is again about the waste, which is what worries me most. And we hear that France and other countries are shipping their waste off to Africa or other countries that might need some other source of income. My question to you is, if you were to build a plant in Oregon, where would you deposit the waste?
Well, first of all, I don't know. I had never heard that France was sending their waste to Africa, and I'd be real surprised if that were going on. If we built a plant in Oregon, or if we built a plant anyplace else, we'd put the waste where it's put right now, at the plant site. And it would be stored in pools of water, eventually stored in dry casks. I got pictures of these dry casks if anybody wants to come up and look at them, but they're reinforced concrete, they're very safe. And it would be stored there until it was shipped off-site to a repository, wherever that repository happens to get built in this country. That's what would be done. Yes, sir.
Jim Zarin, City Club member. I want to ask you a little more of a theoretical question going forward on the use of this kind of power. There's a lot of talk in Oregon about electric vehicles and their development, and one of the benefits that always is reported, there's no tailpipe emissions, but then, of course, other people say, well, that's because they're fueled by electricity, and the electricity has to come from someplace, and of course there's emissions there. Do you see in our lifetimes even smaller scale nuclear where light rail or buses or even our own personal vehicles might be operated by little tiny nuclear reactors? Is that completely out of possibility, or are we just not smart enough yet?
I would say I don't expect to see that in my lifetime. But you do raise an interesting point. When you look at electric cars, the demand for electricity sometimes comes from unforeseen sources. Nobody in the 70s predicted that today 13% of our electric demand would come from electronics and computers and some of those sources that nobody saw coming. And electric cars is one of those areas where it could have a huge impact on the demand for sources of electricity, non-carbon sources. The other thing I would say, I didn't mention this, but I talked to one utility executive who has a lot of coal in his system, and they're looking at some of the carbon legislation coming out of the Congress, and they're asking themselves the question, do we shut down all of our coal production and replace it with nuclear? That's one of the options that they're considering to address the carbon problem. And you need large, new sources of baseload energy to be able to do that. Yes, sir.
Jason Kafori, City Club member. If you could just take a moment and walk through, in a worst-case scenario, total meltdown in one of your plants versus a Trojan-sized plant or a Chernobyl-sized plant, what is the difference in terms of catastrophe? How far would a radiation cloud go? How many people could be affected, depending on whether it was near a urban center or not? And also in light of what we just saw in the Gulf with Deepwater Horizon and the disaster that's happening there. Thanks.
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't know how to do that. I mean, we had a group of people come in from the National Academy of Sciences, chaired by Michael Cordini, University of Wisconsin National Academy of Sciences, And what we asked them to do is look at scenarios that could lead to a release of radiation. And we'd identified 7 scenarios. They went through them in great detail, and they said 4 of them can't even happen, won't lead to a release. 3 of them, we're looking at, ways to mitigate that, design around it, and so forth. If you do have a release that goes through the pool of water, I mean, I think you get to the point where it stops being meaningful in terms of what those scenarios look like. Back in 1957, there was a report that was done, a famous name called WASH 740, and it was intended to answer that kind of question. And so they said, what happens if you have a nuclear plant and 50% of all the radioactive material from this plant is dispersed into the atmosphere as a very fine aerosol under the very worst weather conditions near a big city, and no surprise, huge, horrible consequences. And so then you found people in the 60s and 70s starting to say that's what would happen, because that's what happens when you start having that conversation. That's what would happen, in the case of a nuclear accident. One critic, when 3 Mile Island was going on, was going around the country saying, if that becomes a meltdown, we would wipe out the entire state of Pennsylvania. Well, it was a meltdown, and we didn't wipe out the entire state of Pennsylvania. And so those conversations, I was on a talk show in 1976, and the host looked at me and he said, I've got this report, referring to this WASH 740 report. He says, this says 3,300 people are going to die if you have an accident in a nuclear power plant. Well, that's, 3,300 people weren't going to die if you have an accident. And then he looked at me and says, don't those people matter to you? And I said, well, of course they matter. But what about the 25,000 people that die every year from the pollution caused by coal plants? Don't those people matter to you? I mean, there isn't any free lunch here. There isn't any free lunch. And it's a case of matter of risk. And I think my view, and I think a lot of other people's view, is if you look at the risks that we're dealing with here, very, very, very small. Yes?
Martha Dishke, City Club member.
Sorry, we've run to the end of our time. We don't have any more time for questions during the broadcast, but stick around. I'm sure he'll stay a few minutes longer. Please join us next week on May 21st for a discussion of how to keep your heart healthy. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's guest, Dr. Paul Lorenzini. We're adjourned.